Let's just put it this way. The Americans had to appeal to the Taliban for time and cooperation to get their last people out, and still left behind some US citizens, according to the Pentagon. But what's the future? Is the longer term settled? Well, I'd just point out that when the US first pulled out of Iraq under Barack Obama, it was only 3 years later that they went back in again in force, this time to deal with one of the knock-on effects or consequences of the US-led destabilisation of the region, of which Australia was part, of course, and that was to go back into Iraq to deal with so-called Islamic State, Daesh. So we don't know what the future holds, but we do know that the Taliban now control all of Afghanistan, something they've never had before. We do know that the Taliban now has a lot of American bequeathed equipment, kit and capability that they didn't have before. And we do know that they have never severed their links with al-Qaeda, that al-Qaeda has, according to a report written last year for the UN Security Council, has maintained hundreds of fighters supported by and harboured by the Taliban in Afghanistan. So the original problem of 20 years ago remains the current threat, and whether the US and or its allies will need to make some military intervention into Afghanistan again in the months and years ahead remains an open question and has to be a possibility.
Peter, what has it done, this chaotic end to this 20-year campaign? What has it done for the US's reputation as an ally?
Well, it's a very savage blow to US credibility because what it means is that US allies everywhere now have to have more doubts about the judgment and competence of the US. And, there's a couple of elements. One is people will say, well, it was inevitable that the US had to get out of Afghanistan. There's that decision. And maybe it was, although I'd point out that major US bases remain in South Korea, Japan and Germany, 50 to 70 years on. So there's no inevitability that this is a matter of political will. But the secondary question is the question of competence. Whether the decision is made to get out or not is correct. It's the way in which it's executed, and that has been a demonstration of world-class incompetence, which must undercut the confidence of US allies everywhere, and emboldens and encourages and excites US rivals everywhere, so that US threats in future will be taken even less seriously than they have been to now.
Which brings us to the 70th anniversary of the ANZUS treaty, Peter. With the rise of China in the region, this pact between Australia, New Zealand and the US, how well has it served us, and does it have to be reframed?
Well, the ANZUS treaty, the anniversary of which falls tomorrow, and it's a pretty unhappy coincidence that it should fall exactly as the US has had what the former US Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of NATO, Jim Stavridis, has called this hemorrhaging of American honour going on at exactly the same time. That's a very unfortunate circumstance. But the alliance itself, in its own right, has served Australia very well in lots of ways that aren't manifest or in any sort of kinetic way. For example, Australia has built its defence forces largely on kit, equipment and technology acquired from the US, which it gets access to because it's an ally. The US supplies most of the intelligence, the international intelligence that comes to Australia comes from and through the US. So it's provided those benefits and assets along the way. At a cost, of course, of Australia participating in America's adventures and misadventures, including the Iraq War and, of course, Afghanistan. And does it need to be reframed, recalibrated is the second part of your question. Well, I would say it definitely does. That Australia has, in recent years, been freeloading on the alliance. You'll remember that when the Gillard government signed with Barack Obama the agreement to rotate US Marines through the Northern Territory, that as soon as that deal was done, the Gillard government, in its next two budgets, cut sharply into the Australian defence budget, And as a percentage of GDP, the Australian defence spending went back to its pre-World War II level, its 1939 level. There was a clear-cut case of freeloading. We've got an American quasi-base here. We'll let them worry about our security. We're not going to worry so much. Australia now, in the face of first a rising and aggressive and coercive China, and second, a newly revealed, more unreliable US, really has to take its own fate and its own security into its own hands in a way it has never done.
And do you think the government currently is up for the challenge? How vulnerable does that then leave us in the region?
Well, the Morrison government, to its credit, inherited the work of the Turnbull government in standing up to the Chinese government's encroachments into Australian sovereignty. And that's in terms of foreign interference and espionage, and there were the attempts to dominate the Australian 5G system through Huawei and so on. So they've done that, and they get credit for that. They get credit for talking up defence capability and future security planning. However, we would have to say that in terms of delivery on defence and security capability, the Morrison government, like previous Australian governments, is seriously underperforming. While the Chinese government is producing a new submarine on average, launching into the ocean, into the South China Sea, every 18 months, Australia is waiting well into the 2030s to get the first of our new fleet of submarines, if they're on schedule. We are clearly undercooked, underexposed, and last year the government had to produce a so-called strategic defence update, which tore up its previous assumptions and had to admit that all the assumptions that, for example, that Australia would have a 10-year warning time before any serious challenge to our security, that assumption was now dead, and a bunch of other assumptions as well. We have been caught unawares, caught in the grip of what I call Australia's traditional enemy, Bev, and that's our own complacency.
Peter, thank you so much. Good to talk.
Pleasure, Bev.